My name is Alden Lai. I serve as Executive Advisor to the Wellbeing for Planet Earth Foundation, which is based in Japan, and I'm also an Assistant Professor in Public Health at New York University. The Wellbeing for Planet Earth Foundation was established in 2019, in recent years, it really coincided with efforts in Japan to be really putting well-being at the heart of policymaking in Japan. So just recently, Japan has created and released a national well-being dashboard, and also kind of like included well-being as part of its KPI, across kind of like different policy sectors. Recently, Japan has also committed $50 billion to the creation of an initiative to invest in community well-being through digital means. So we're really excited by the prospects of that and how Japan is really taking an active role to be including well-being in its policy and programs. But to mention, as we're talking about Japan, I guess we can't, we received really shocking news this morning, just with the assassination of previous Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And Professor Suzukan is in a room today with the president of the foundation, Yoshiki, and Professor Suzukan has been good friends with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe for 30 years, even before he became a politician. And I just got to know that it was really through the advocacy and kind of like connections and conversations behind the scenes that really pushed Japan to, in a very short period of time, put well-being, in its heart, in the heart of its policy making. So I'm sure on behalf of the global kind of like people in the room, and I'm sure I'm joined by the global community as we're sharing our shock and also our deeper sympathies to our friends in Japan. So with that, so today we are joined by a group of distinguished panelists. We have Amanda Janoo, who is Economics and Policy Lead at the Wellbeing Economic Alliance. We have Andrew Rzepa, yes, a silent R, that's right. We have Andrew Rzepa, who is partner at Gallup, and then we have Professor John Helliwell. So it is challenging to try to talk about well-being, kind of like policy and global initiatives around the world, apart from the UK, in 45 minutes. We're trying to cover around the world. To me, it's really impossible. So I think what I'm really hoping to achieve today is try to distill lessons for, number one, lessons from different kind of like countries, including the context that could be transferred between country to country. I think it's easy to say that, whatever happens in country X can't really happen in country Y. But I do believe that as long as we're able to to understand the context, the implementation processes, there are still some lessons we can really learn. And the second thing I'm really hoping for us to achieve is to also, because we're in a room of researchers as well, is for researchers to find out if they were to initiate some cross-cultural studies or international collaborations, what should they be focusing on? So with that, let me just pass on the mic to Amanda, who will be sharing some perspectives. Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks so much. Can everybody hear me? Wonderful. So I started to study economics because I really saw the world as this Venn diagram with all of these social and environmental, political, and even spiritual issues, and felt that somewhere towards the center sat the economy. And if we could change this system, then it would ripple out and improve all of these other areas of life. And so, with starry eyes, I remember taking my first economics class and immediately being very annoyed and confused because, as Joe was saying earlier, what I found was a very narrow and dogmatic discipline that, spoke about profits and wealth and GDP growth rates as if it mattered more than life itself. And for me, that really began my now decades-long sort of love-hate relationship with economics and a desire to find new economic paradigms and approaches that could be blueprints for the better world we envision. And so I remember when the financial crisis happened, thinking, this is going to be the moment when mainstream economics and policy approaches are going to be fundamentally transformed. But it took a little while for it to seep in. Yeah, I think it took maybe 7, 10 years, and now we're seeing this incredible renaissance in economic thinking. And so the well-being economy movement comes under a lot of different banners. So whether that's post-growth, ecological economics, solidarity economy, business for the common good, buen vivir, and many, many more. But ultimately, at their heart, what they have in common is a recognition that we need to stop treating people and planet like they're here to serve the economy and start treating the economy like it's here to serve us. So what I can say from my experience working at WEAll thus far is that I really think, at least in terms of the Beyond GDP movement, something that was once really fringe actually feels almost mainstream. Around the world, governments are now developing alternative metrics of progress to really focus on what matters for a good life now and for generations to come. But what I've also found is that most of them seem to get stuck there. Yeah? They're not able to really make sense of these multidimensional indicators to inform really transformative strategies and new policy design processes. And I think that one of the major challenges is because we're trying to elevate the social and the environmental at the same level as the economic, but they're not commensurate. Yeah? So the economy is just a word for the way we produce and provide for one another. It's an aspect of our society that is embedded within a larger ecosystem. And so ultimately, you know, we're continuing, even with these different metrics, continuing to apply this certain economic logic at all of these other stages of the policy design cycle, searching, for example, to figure out how can we calculate the economic benefits of health, as opposed to swapping that burden of proof and assessing the economy's contribution to our health and well-being. And I realize that this is no small task, because it really requires us to downgrade the economy and recognize that it's a means, it's a driver, and not an end in and of itself. It requires us to ask what truly matters for the well-being of all species on our planet, yeah, and then to consider the ways that we can provide for one another that is ultimately going to ensure social justice on a healthy planet. So around the world, we are seeing some visionary examples of governments trying to figure out how to really invoke systemic change within our economic system in order to achieve their well-being goals. And so most notably is probably the Wellbeing Economy Governments, or WEGO, which currently is comprised of Iceland, New Zealand, Wales, Finland, Scotland, and most recently Canada joined. And I'm really particularly excited about Canada's new well-being framework and budget, because they've begun to measure meaning and purpose as a key indicator in their well-being framework. Because, you know, as the late David Graeber found, in countries like mine, the majority of people feel like they have a job that need not or should not exist. Yeah? So a job that they feel like is contributing nothing to society or actively making it worse off. And the thing is, there's nothing inevitable, right, about the fact that we have an almost perfect inverse relationship between how much you earn and how much you're contributing to society. It's based on this standard policy logic that we just need to grow the economy as quickly as possible so we can take some of that wealth through taxes to fix the damages done to people and planet in the process. But ultimately, we can, once we swap and look at well-being, it allows us to really consider, you know, how can we move upstream, actually take a preventative and long-term perspective in order to identify and support the economic activities and behaviors that are really contributing to those goals. And so I think COVID has actually been a really incredible example in this sense, as it did not take policymakers very long to identify what kinds of sectors or workers were most essential at least maintaining, you know, current well-being. And spoiler alert, it was not the hedge fund managers. Yeah, it was farmers and grocery clerks, nurses, plumbers, and many other types of workers that are most often undervalued within our current system. And so I think similarly to the financial crisis, it's going to take a little while for this crisis to really settle in. But we're already seeing a rising labor consciousness coming out of this. And I think the next step is that we need to think about future well-being and the well-being of our planet as well, and to really think about how can we expand our understanding of what the economy is and can be, so that our work as caregivers or artists or stewards of the earth, right, are valued truly for the happiness and well-being that they bring. So since I'm with some amazing academics and thinkers here, I really wanted to take the opportunity to just ask you, I think the major innovations to come are going to be when we focus on social and ecological well-being, and then we disaggregate economic information in order to identify the kinds of production processes, the kinds of business structures, the kinds of goods and services, and ultimately, provision systems that are truly contributing most to social and ecological well-being. So policymakers have that research foundation of things that we already intuitively know to encourage and reward those companies the way that we have been supporting the large multinationals and exploitive sort of businesses that have been the most efficient at generating profits and wealth so far. So I will just conclude in saying that I think in my experience, the major barriers in this movement is really just our own imaginations. I think we tend to assume that any other economic system is going to be a worse one. But the reality is, I think what we've heard throughout this whole conference is that if we take a moment to think about when we feel most at peace, most cared for, and most aligned with our life's purpose, that's where you find the foundations of a well-being economy. And I believe that's worth fighting for. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I think maybe we can just move on to Andrew next.
Yeah, so I suppose before going into my intervention, I just want to reflect how far we've travelled over the past 15 years. So just look around, look at the calibre of individuals around the room and the level of the conversations that we're having. It's almost unimaginable to think that we would have been here 15 years ago. And so I used 15 years as a time frame because that was when Gallup originally conceived the World Poll. So we brought together some of our closest friends, Danny, John, Ed, some of Gallup's best minds, to think, how could we actually measure what matters most across the world on an annual basis using representative samples in 145 countries every year. And so when that was conceived, obviously we hoped that we'd get to a place where the world would, where countries, where governments would start engaging with these metrics to actually better understand their populations. And so we've made progress. A number of countries are doing that, but not enough. And so essentially I'm going to use the rest of my time to talk about how can we do that? How can we encourage global adoption of these figures? How do we mainstream it so we're in the forms? So in the same way GDP is in the forms, how can we get well-being there? And so my original training was as a lawyer, and so occasionally I try and reflect back on some of those types of structures and frameworks. And so in international law, there are two forms of international law, de jure and de facto. De jure are essentially pieces of legislation which have been recognized with a hallmark of approval by an official body. De facto are essentially laws which are normative. Everybody applies them, everyone uses them, yet there's no kind of universal body saying, these are the ones you need to use. And so, as a community, we've slowly moved towards life evaluation as essentially a de facto measure of well-being in society. How do we make that a de jure measure? How do we get that official badge of approval in order to say, this is one of the key metrics that matter? And so, to throw my hat into the ring, for want of a better expression, the United Nations, the Sustainable Development Goals, obviously we've spoken about them a few times, they've come up in conversation, but ultimately that's one of the few frameworks where you have basically all of the countries across the world agreeing upon a set of normative standards and a set of essentially measures that they agree to measure over time and report on the international stage. And so that makes me reflect, why didn't we get an SDG on well-being? So there's 238 indicators. SDG 3 is actually health and well-being, yet there's no life evaluation metric in there. So actually I was at one of the meetings of the Interagency Expert Working Group on the SDGs, when actually, I'm not sure if I'm breaking confidence, but the OECD said, okay, let's have life evaluation in there. It was considered for approximately 60 seconds before it was thrown out. And so this makes me think, as a community, what do we need to be doing in order to make sure that when 2030 arises, we're organized, we're ready in order to mobilize and say, okay, this, as the academic, as the business, as the political community, is what we're suggesting matters most and what we need to be measuring on a consistent basis. And so I suppose with my other hat, I'm Executive Director for Gallup's partnerships with the SDGs. And so through the World Poll, we actually measure 4 Sustainable Development Goal indicators. So I've got a few kind of tactics and a few kind of bits of knowledge which may help us on that journey. So ultimately, it comes down to a few key factors. One is clarity. What is it exactly that we're asking for? And so I've heard, okay, that life evaluation has kind of come to the surface. And so that is actually a moment of clarity which we didn't have in 2015 when there's still battles between affect and life evaluation. But let's try and make sure that we're talking with a single voice. Obviously, between ourselves, a plurality of metrics and conversations is great. But when it comes to actually dealing on that international stage, let's talk with one voice. 2 is validity. Once again, we've made huge leaps and bounds since 2015. All of the work that basically pretty much everyone in this room have undertaken helps show the validity of the work of these life evaluation metrics. So that's another box ticked. Data availability. So a huge number of Tier 2 and Tier 3 SDGs never made it to Tier 1 because there just wasn't data. They were created in a political process without actually the measurement frameworks developed to actually implement them. And so, once again, we've got that box ticked. For food insecurity, the World Poll acted as a proxy which enabled adoption. The fact that we've got so many countries actually measuring life evaluation is once again another great big tick in our box. But we need to talk more about it. We need to talk more about the fact that this is actually adopted. Political support. The fact that I've got a session before the Prime Minister of Iceland is great, it's positive, but let's actually really kind of make sure that we're not just it's not just ad hoc interventions and conversations, but we're actually building a political community within kind of these organizations like the UN, so that we're, once again, stepping forward together to make sure that we're really putting forward our best foot. And finally, credibility. There may be a point here around the language we use. We've heard it come up a few times. Is it happiness? Is it well-being? What serves us best in terms of our mission to get the world talking about what matters most within society? So I've just finished a piece of work with a large philanthropic organization and a UN agency around non-communicable diseases. Nobody understands what non-communicable diseases mean. It's another one of those things where we need to reframe it. We need to find an alternative way of discussing it so that you can get greater levels of engagement. We need to go through a similar kind of thinking process here. In the same way that we need to talk with one voice about metrics, we need to find out what actually resonates most on that political stage, just so that we're actually playing the cards as best as we can in those fora. And so maybe there's kind of a bit of normative setting to do there. And so that's my playbook, that's my strategy, and I'd love to work with you all on that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew. Just being here over the past 2 days, I think we're getting very, very close to having a single voice. We're kind of like, coalescing around kind of like a single voice that could advocate for that kind of like future that we are envisioning. And through Amanda's kind of like point as well is that countries and governments, people are getting more cognizant of the need for alternative kind of like metrics for progress. So we'll come back to those points later on, and now we invite Professor John Helliwell to talk about some of the perspectives that you have on global initiatives and policy making.
Jan asked me to start at the beginning and start at the end. I'm sure he didn't mean I should finish with a song too, It's been a wonderful 2 days. I at least ought to report back on that score. First thing, let me speak with my trained announcer's voice and say, if the first station beyond GDP is misery, we're on the wrong train. The nature of the well-being movement is in fact to emphasize the positives and how you get there. And you must never let the existence and the focus on the negatives dislodge you from that path. And I'll get back to that in a second. In the meantime, to celebrate, let me just give you the bottom line judgment of the days, and especially today. If you'd asked me 2 days ago to forecast what we would hear from these panels during today, would I have dreamt that the difference between what we heard today and what we heard from similar panels 10 years ago would be what it was? I would have said, I don't believe it. So if anybody tells you there's no progress in this revolution of values and policy orientation from what it was to what it should be, in my view, they're just wrong. They haven't watched the process. I'm used to watching slow processes. This, you may think it's slow, but in my view of how institutions change and how views change, it's been extraordinarily fast and extraordinarily collaborative. And so I don't know how you divide the credit for that, but you may share my surprise, but it's a good surprise and not a bad surprise. The next substantive point I'd like to make, it was raised in discussion with Danny last evening. It occurred to me after that. The question is, what revolution in economics is happening and is related to subjective well-being? And the idea that was in my mind 20 years ago when I first saw these data, I said, these ought to revolutionize economics. These are the ability to provide a measure of utility, a primary measure of utility, the absence of which drove the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations apart and caused economics to focus only on the one. The existence of subjective well-being data permits us to now bring those values, which are critically important to everything we're talking about here, back into the same analytic framework and use the tools that economics and other social sciences have in a much more productive and broader setup. So that's the revolution, to change utility from something you assume the structure of to something you try and understand the structure of, because you're getting direct reports from the people who mattered. Now, to me, that's absolutely fundamental, and that's part of the revolutionary process, as I see it, that needs to be made. Within economics, that understanding, that belief isn't really broadly there yet, or you wouldn't find it hard for people who finish PhDs in well-being to get jobs. You wouldn't find economics departments that didn't even teach courses in this. You wouldn't find well-being economics principles textbooks that didn't even have a chapter on well-being. We don't train our public policy analysts in the public policy programs in universities. We don't teach them anything about well-being. Well, you're not going to expect the policy shops in governments to change what they do in fundamental ways until the people we at universities produce have at least a modicum of understanding of what it means to focus on subjective well-being as the basis for designing policies to support better lives. So while the vision is there and the progress is remarkable, the journey ahead is long, both within, I know economics better than the other disciplines, but it's right there in sociology and criminology and all the other support disciplines. They all need to refine themselves. And of course, within healthcare, we've already had conversations about that. It's a big change. Okay, now then how do I come back and say to Andrew, if it's the wrong train to focus on despair now, how do we deal with these issues? And there have been some subtle differences of view you've heard as to whether how you should elevate the disadvantaged in your policy preferences and choices. In what way do you make sure those who are in sorrow and distress and starvation are dealt with, while you're claiming to support well-being as a whole. And the secret is from the immediately applicable part of subjective well-being science, which Richard emphasized, that they provide the wherewithal whereby we can take all these aspects of life and put them on a comparable basis. We call compensating differentials. How much is something worth in terms of something else when it's all very important? And you heard from Gus this morning, they're already there. You're already there in the United Kingdom of having a cost-benefit analysis. Well, economists understand all that. They can easily, not easily maybe, but they're going to be persuaded by people like Gus and other people to simply change the way in which cost-benefit analysis is done. All right, now, how do I use that information to make the case for what the right way is to choose policies that do help the disadvantaged? And my experience and use of these methods is clear enough that pretty well, if you then choose the policies that produce the most well-being for the money invested in them, and sort of following the playbook of that Richard and others have developed, you will find, in fact, that the immediate points of impact, the policies that rank highest in terms of total value of happiness produced, in fact, are focused right on the people at the lowest end of the distribution now, for obvious reasons. It's a more subtle one, that an investment in social capital turns out, in fact, to have the biggest gains for those who are discriminated against, who are unemployment or in ill health. And the other is, when you're doing an interventions, often, the first time around when you roll out a new program, you're not sure how to design it, how it's going to work, but you want to do your test runs, not if you want a balanced evaluation, but if you want even your test run to produce the best returns, you want to apply it where the gains are likely to be largest. Well, when it's improving well-being, it's going into those communities and those parts of the population that are suffering most, because they have the most to gain. And so, yes, you'll get rates of return that are very high, and those policies will be chosen, and that's quite all right. You're saying you're not having to sort of divide the society and say, we're forgetting about the rest of society because we're looking after the poor. In fact, if you do adopt a well-being metric and apply it straightforwardly, you probably won't even need to give the kind of boost up that people have been talking about in those evaluations. They'll rank up top anyway. Well, if they don't, one more thing you want to think about is that consistently, we find that people value living in a society with more equality of well-being. That's what the analysis of well-being equality in the context of well-being is telling us. So that gives you already something to add, because it's obviously something that has the biggest gains for those at the bottom of the ladder are going to be ones that reduce the inequality of the distribution the most. My guess is you won't even need that boost, which is a real boost and belongs in the bottom line of the calculation. But you'll find, in fact, the biggest gainers from these policies will, in fact, be the people who all of us think should be the ones that do it, in a context where no one is losing.
So, John, can I just thank you so much for that. So, in light of the progress that the science of well-being kind of has made, and also kind of the policy impact that we are seeing, and how there's a wider, compared to 10 years ago, recognition in terms of why this is needed, it just seems like it's, just back to Andrew's point, that we're at a kind of a tipping point in terms of having more policy efforts, say particularly around the SDGs, for example, in terms of explicating metrics of well-being. And then, it's in addition to explicating that, it's also signaling to the rest of the world that this is really important, and then there are lessons that you can really learn, and there's a science backing up kind of these policies as well. So I just wanted to go back to Amanda's point in terms of the WeGo, the alliance between kind of different countries, like Iceland, New Zealand, Scotland, for example, and Andrew's point on the importance of political support. So Amanda, would you mind kind of sharing with us how the coalition or WeGo kind of got together? What was the secret kind of sauce, if you will, behind? And how do we basically tie that at some point in terms of gaining more support, meaning the single voice that Andrew was kind of like talking about, combining the science that we have made to eventually kind of really elevate well-being at the global agenda that is on par or kind of like really taken into serious consideration along with the GDP. So perhaps, Amanda, you want to go ahead?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the beginning of WeGo was really a story of some young women, lady leaders coming together and recognizing that we need a new vision of progress and a new way of organizing this whole system. And so I think it's not a coincidence. I think there's just a different way with which women might be thinking about these sort of issues and even the role and the purpose of the economy. I often talk about, this paradigm shift we're in as, to me, seemingly a bit like a feminist revolution in the sense that it's about moving from very linear, mechanistic, siloed, hierarchical ways of thinking and organizing and doing things to much more holistic, systemic, emergent, and compassionate ways of living together on this planet. And so, I guess the story there is one of feminism.
Women leaders getting together to create that coalition. But also in our experience in terms of like any policy kind of like or any recommendations to international organizations like the United Nations, like the OECD, usually it's best that you have a coalition of like country and kind of like country members coming together. So Andrew, do you have kind of like any other perspectives on that?
Absolutely. So capacity development, it's language which is taken from the field of development, but is incredibly applicable here. So obviously there's a number of countries which are at the vanguard of well-being policy making, and they've trodden a tough, hard path in order to get rigorous and credible interventions and programs in place. And so why should countries who are also looking to engage with this have to try and recreate the wheel? And so once again, with WeGo, you've got great potential figureheads who can help frame some of those tough to have conversations around why this is important. Work Centre for Wellbeing has got a huge repository of just programs, interventions and knowledge which could be ported into a whole variety of different contexts. So it's these types of things. How can we start to think about this more strategically? And what are some of those individual tactics that we need to be deploying in order to really move everybody forward on a consistent basis?
Yeah, and John, just one last question before we open Q&A to the floor is that just based on some of the conversations I've heard during the past 2 days as well, there's kind of like some concerns about, well, if you're talking about well-being, what about kind of like, say, low and middle income countries that kind of like are still prioritizing other areas that potentially are, kind of like related to basic needs of like infrastructure, etc. So how would you kind of like make that comparison or the argument that this is not just about a group of countries that are kind of like with developed economies, but it's really kind of like everyone banding together because it's needed for the world to progress as a whole?
When Unilever was asked about the trade-off, he said there is no trade-off. It's the same here. Yeah. There is no rich-poor distinction about whether subjective well-being should be the goal. The actual things that need to be done in order to improve it are going to differ from place to place, and where basic needs aren't met, you're going to be providing basic needs and so on. So this gives everybody a framework within which they can be efficient in the right sense, efficient in terms of human resources and financial resources, at solving their current problems and building better futures. And in some sense, for the countries or people within countries who are furthest behind, that opening of doors to new opportunities and the positive possibilities for getting there are even more important. So there's no sense in which I think this is a rich country's game, or should be.
Yeah, so it's a false dichotomy, really, that we ought to avoid. All right, so in the last 5 minutes that we have, we can open the, have questions from the floor. And Nancy.
I was really struck, Andrew, by your comment about the SDGs not having a wellbeing goal, because it's kind of like the action plan to a happier world. So my question is, what would the goal be if it was a wellbeing goal? So we had a go at it in the Levelling Up Mission 8, which was by 2030, wellbeing will have improved in every area of the UK, and the gap between the top performing and other areas closing, so trying to get at that inequality. I don't think we've got it right yet. So what would be the goal if we had a wellbeing SDG?
So if I'm bold enough to say life evaluation. So going into 2030, the political dynamics are going to be incredibly different than they were in 2015. So in 2015, you had the Millennium Development Goals, massive progress in terms of poverty, hunger reduction, etc. We don't have that at the moment, and it doesn't look like it's going to get any better in the future. Also, the world's becoming increasingly multipolar. So the consensus that existed around 2015 is highly, highly unlikely to be there. And so that's part of the reason why I'm saying now, 7 years in advance of 2030, that we really need to start thinking about this. And ultimately, almost putting everything on its head. And I'd say subjective well-being is a phenomenal umbrella indicator. If you're food insecure, your life evaluation scores go down. If you have access to savings, your life evaluation scores go up. So if you live in a high-trust social capital world, your life evaluation scores go up. So for me, it's how can we actually maybe be so bold to say, let's try and actually use 2030 as an opportunity to have that as a flagship indicator, which isn't going to be one of 17, which isn't going to be one of 234 indicators, but it's going to have a degree of primacy about it.
Can I try on that too? In complete agreement with both of you. The point is to use life evaluations as an aggregator, as a way of helping you to make choices as to where the investments are best. So that's it, their role in the SDGs, to find out which one of these ones, in fact, are moved here and there. How much should we be investing in that one as opposed to another one, where subjective well-being is an aggregator, but you have to adjust it, obviously, because there are some of these long-term factors that have no direct counterpart. And so Chris Barrington-Lee would remind us. But the same issue applies in these rosette indicator sets. You have to pull life evaluations out of that and use them to help you value the other. There's lots of time to improve that, but I think you need some notion of where you're trying to go, and I agree completely with Andrew about that.
Well, I just think that if our vision is going to be so bold as to have a kind of like, to have an indicator in the SDGs on just well-being, obviously life evaluation, because of what Andrew's point about clarity, validity, we have data availability, we have that. But then, in any SDGs, there's a whole kind of like list of other metrics as well that creates the space for all of the work that, the scientific community has been doing as well. So it's not, so we do have the space to advocate for that. And then in addition to life evaluation, all the other important metrics that, all of us in the academic community has been kind of like debating as well. So I think I saw a hand in the middle behind Nancy. Oh, okay. Please, Fala.
I'd like to emphasize that there is not a one single SDG on well-being, but if you look at the individual indicators for well-being, for example, that Iceland has chosen, we can link them to different targets under different SDGs. So I think a good job would be when the SDGs are reviewed, maybe halfway, would be to assemble them all into one new SDG. You guys could promote that.
And I think we've got time for perhaps one last question. Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. That was a really stimulating session. I hope you don't mind if I ask a provocative question. So a lot of the discussion was about quite high-level policy processes and quite high-level metrics, and that's great because a lot of policy does happen at that level, but a lot of policy also happens at quite a low level in things like schools and hospitals and local governments, and it's delivered by nurses and teachers and social workers. And I wonder whether the metrics that we're talking about help those people to improve the way that they do their job for promoting well-being. So life expectancy, for example, very common metric in the wellbeing frameworks doesn't really tell you what's going good or bad in your health system. Is there any value in going to the places where policy meets users and asking them what wellbeing means to them and how we could measure it?
It's a really, really important point, actually, and I think this is where we get into the actual policy design process, yeah, because of course we need a different sort of vision of progress. The ways in which that is articulated and communicated, I think some of the most important effective examples around the world are where it is on the basis of public consultation and dialogue that people actually identify the things that really matter for them. And so, you know, a lot of the examples, Germany, for example, did this massive public consultation with all of their different regions, and they found thousands of different things, right? But it was a mix of values, yeah, outcomes and processes. And I think it's important to be able to hold space for those different dimensions so that you can start to understand their interconnections. And so then when it also comes to one of the most important things for me is actually, if you're going to engage people at the beginning of a process, you need to make sure you're engaging them throughout, yeah? So they're engaged in the monitoring and evaluation as well, because this is really also, the crisis of democracy right now is very connected to all of the other crises of our time, and so we need much more deliberative decision-making, particularly, in my perspective, around the economy, which is one of the least democratically governed sort of areas, so that people really feel like the policies, the strategies, the actions that are being implemented are a reflection of what really truly matters for them.
Thank you, Amanda. I think the timing of the consultation matters too. So I'm a native of Singapore, and we are having a change in the Prime Minister and the leadership, and it is kind of like around a change when you're announcing we are now doing a public consultation to kind of like to gather voices from the citizens and to kind of like to find out more about what's really important. So to me, it's that kind of like infrastructure, but there's also a strategic element to it in terms of timing to signal to the citizens that we are really kind of like concerned about these. Unfortunately, I know we've got lots of different, questions and interests. Yeah, well, I'm cognizant of the time because I know that the Prime Minister of Iceland is starting in kind of like 2 minutes. So I think, I think we should just conclude for now. I'm so sorry. And please continue the conversations later on. Thank you.